To talk about the best non-conference matchups in college football coming up this fall. We've checked out the SEC, the Big Ten, and the ACC. We've looked over all the schedules in the Big 12, and we don't have a whole lot here. The Big 12 needs to step up the non-conference schedules. Last season, brutal. This season, just about as bad. Let's check out the numbers. We investigated the top 25 matchups from last season. Listen to these numbers. The SEC played 13 total games. Now, we're talking regular season and bowl games. The SEC played 13 against the top 25 last season. That is even with the SEC probably taking up almost half the top 25 itself. The Big Ten also played 13 games against the top 25, and the ACC last season played 13 games against the final top 25. That's 13 for the other three power conferences that we have reviewed. The Big 12 played 5 games total all season, bowl games included, against top 25 competition from outside the conference. And they lost just about all those huge games. Of course, Kansas State and Oklahoma going down big in bowl games. Oklahoma also losing to Notre Dame at home during the regular season. TCU lost to Michigan State in a bowl game as well, even though the Spartans finished at 7-6 out of the top 25. Probably the biggest win for the Big 12 last season out of conference was Baylor defeating a 5-loss UCLA team in the Holiday Bowl. UCLA strong, but did not finish in the top 25. But we do our due diligence here on Mark Rogers TV, and we do deliver the best non-conference games for Big 12 competition coming up here in 2013. And there are only 2 against the top 25. That compares to 6 for the SEC, 8 for the Big Ten, and 10 for the ACC. Here they are. Co-champion Kansas State, of course, got the BCS nod because they defeated Oklahoma head-to-head last season. Their best game against Louisiana-Lafayette this year. K-State did play Miami last season, but again, this season it's Louisiana-Lafayette. For K-State, the losses are huge. They lose one of the Heisman candidates, of course, quarterback Colin Klein, who did it all for the past few years in Manhattan, along with the front 7 on defense. That's the entire front 7 gone, and both starting cornerbacks. The good news for Bill Snyder's team, back is the entire offensive line and the top 3 safeties on the depth chart. 3 really good safeties. Okay, the quarterback duties go over to Daniel Sams. Most likely, he's the front runner right now, and he certainly is a runner. Think Colin Klein a few years ago. He has yet to polish his passing skills. Klein, of course, never became a great passing quarterback, but he became efficient through the air, and Daniel Sams is going to have to follow in that mold. He's going to be pushed by a JUCO transfer, Jake Waters at Kansas State. So that's the best non-conference game for Kansas State. It comes on September 7th against Louisiana-Lafayette. All right, Oklahoma, we credit you for scheduling Notre Dame home and home. So Notre Dame won that matchup last season in Norman, 30-13, of course, en route to the BCS National Championship game. The Sooners went 10-3. They lost their 3 biggest games of the year, Kansas State, Notre Dame, and to Johnny Manziel and Texas A&M in the Cotton Bowl. Landry Jones, gone. Best offensive lineman, possibly in the country. Lane Johnson, gone. Tony Jefferson, the leader on defense in the defensive backfield, gone. Blake Bell takes over at quarterback for Oklahoma. We know him well as the Belldozer on 3rd and 4th down short situations. He can run it, run straight ahead. He's fast, and most likely, more than anything, he is physical. But can he run the offense in true Bob Stoops style, passing the football a la Landry Jones on a regular basis? That has yet to be seen. So Oklahoma could be in for a bit of a down year as well. The defense has been deteriorating in recent years. Gave up a ton of yardage defensively last season against the better teams. Oklahoma 10-3 last season will again play Notre Dame, but this time in South Bend with Everett Golson back at quarterback as a sophomore at Notre Dame. That comes up on September 28th, probably the marquee game of the season, non-conference in the Big 12. September 14th, we've got Texas taking on Ole Miss. Again, a home-and-home series here as the Rebels take on the Longhorns. And anytime you take on the SEC, of course, it becomes a marquee game. And Ole Miss is on a roll. They're a hot commodity nationally right now after playing LSU to the wire late in the season, blowing out Mississippi State, and then winning a bowl game against Pitt and then most importantly, hauling in a top 5 recruiting class. Hugh Freeze is hot. The Rebels coming off a 7-6 campaign, and for Texas, this could be a bit of a trap game. They have to go to Provo the week before to take on BYU. Texas at 9-4 had an up and down season last year, really underachieved defensively. Considering that who's who prep stars all over the place on defense, they really underachieved. Gave up 192 yards rushing per game, and they were my 2012 pick to win the Big 12. Failed miserably, but they might be primed to do it this year. 10 starters back on offense for Texas. This year, they host Ole Miss after defeating the Rebs 66-31, but we expect a much closer game as the Rebels certainly hit their stride late in 2012. Texas-Ole Miss should be an interesting one on September 14th from Austin. Next, we've got Oklahoma State at 8-5 taking on Mississippi State at 8-5. The Bulldogs, as usual, didn't play anyone out of conference last season, beat everybody they were supposed to beat, and lost to all the big heavy hitters in the SEC. Again, in going 8-5 after a bowl loss to Northwestern. Oklahoma State coming off a thumping of Purdue in the heart of Dallas Bowl, 58-14. Clint Shelf and J.W. Walsh will be the combatants at quarterback. Shelf is the passer, most notably in the Mike Gundy mold, the type of passing quarterback that he likes, a la Brandon Weeden. Walsh is the rusher. They will each throw, whoever wins this starting job, to one of the emerging threats in the Big 12, Josh Stewart. It's a typical Big 12 defense for Oklahoma State, meaning tons of points and tons of yardage, but they do have two of the best defensive tackles in the Big 12 in James Castleman and Calvin Barnett. They will take on two productive offensive players for Mississippi State returning this year at quarterback, Tyler Russell, after throwing 24 touchdown passes in Starkville last season, and 1,000-yard rusher Ladarius Perkins. A game that will fly under the radar, but will be mighty important early on for Oklahoma State and Mississippi State, a couple of 8-win teams from last season. August 31st, Week 1, Oklahoma State hosting Mississippi State. On August 30th, that means a Friday night before most of the big games launch on that Week 1 Saturday, it's Texas Tech taking on SMU. The Red Raiders finished at 8-5 last season after a bowl win over Minnesota, 34-31. SMU at 10-3. But the Mustangs have lost 6 all-conference players from that 10-win team, and the defensive backfield looks to be horrible. That's bad news for the Mustangs, of course, in particular in this Week 1 matchup with Texas Tech, because they will sling it all over the field. They've got their head coach back, a Texas Tech guy in Cliff Kingsbury, one of the prolific passers in Tech history, coming back to head coach this team. They don't play anyone as well, non-conference. This is about as good as it gets in Lubbock, taking on SMU. Quarterback Michael Brewer takes over the second-rated pass offense in the country. And what proved to be the linchpin in the Red Raiders' success last season was actually the defense, which finished second in total yards given up in the Big 12. So August 30th, Texas Tech 8-5, taking on an SMU team that won 10 last season but looks to be a bit down this season. All right, on that Saturday night, August 31st, we've got a good one at Cowboys Stadium with TCU coming off a 7-6 campaign, taking on the SEC's LSU Tigers at 10-3. Okay, this is the number 1 defense in the Big 12 last season. Unfortunately, despite 9 starters back, the good news against LSU, for TCU, they're missing their Defensive Player of the Year in the Big 12, Devontae Fields, a monster, a freshman who just played off the end, played off the pass rush, off the edge in an incredible way last season, but he is suspended for 2 games, so he misses the big LSU game here against the LSU Tigers at Cowboys Stadium. Zach Mettenberger back at quarterback for LSU. He underachieved last season, except he stepped up big in the Alabama showdown in Baton Rouge and should have won that football game, really tore up the Tide, and aside from Johnny Manziel, certainly performed better than any quarterback on the Tide's schedule. It's TCU-LSU on August 31st at Cowboys Stadium. All right, on September 21st, we've got West Virginia's biggest game, and this is kind of indicative of what we see in the Big 12 in non-conference scheduling. West Virginia's biggest game against 2-10 Maryland. All right, Geno Smith's gone, Tavon Austin gone, and Stedman Bailey. They produced ridiculous amounts of yardage and points for West Virginia. The quarterback battle goes to Paul Milliard and also Ford Childress for West Virginia. We'll see in August who will emerge as Geno Smith's replacement, Millard or Childress. And we had to go with the Maryland game as West Virginia's best non-conference matchup because the other two choices were Georgia State or William and Mary. Step it up, West Virginia. Okay, you played LSU a few years ago. Let's schedule more from the SEC and the other BCS conferences. All right, on September 21st, we've got Baylor at 8-5 taking on Louisiana-Monroe. Again, for the Bears, this is the best matchup we could find non-conference. Running back Lachey Seastrunk says, I'm going to win the Heisman. He said that before the bowl game against UCLA, and he had a great back half of the season. Check out the game log for Seastrunk. He was basically non-existent early in the season, barely carried the football like 12 or 15 times the first half of the season, then got a chance and poured it on. This guy put up huge numbers, and he would like to win a Heisman. Well, first, let's beat Louisiana-Monroe on September 21st. Quarterback Bryce Petty of Baylor takes over for Nick Florence. He hit on 13 of 15 in the spring game for the Baylor Bears. Again, coming off that massive win over UCLA in the Holiday Bowl, 49-26. Baylor looked primed in that one. And on September 21st, they take on their toughest non-conference foe in Louisiana-Monroe. All right, September 14th, we've got Iowa State taking on Iowa. We know the Hawkeyes only finished 4-8 last season, but again, it's a weak non-conference slate for Iowa State. This, by far, their toughest game. Iowa is 4-8, but it's a Big Ten foe. It's a state rivalry. It's always a big game for Iowa State, taking on Big Brother Iowa. And the Cyclones have certainly not come anywhere close to the win production of the Hawkeyes in the past decade to 15 years, but they've overachieved in this rivalry and won another game in this matchup in 2012. Sam Richardson takes over at quarterback. He emerged for the Cyclones at the back half of 2012, throwing 8 touchdowns against just 1 pick, and in particular had a great game against West Virginia, 119 yards rushing and 3 touchdowns. And we see from the TD to pick ratio, he knows what he's doing in the pocket as well. That's Sam Richardson for Iowa State. Kirk Ferentz, the Iowa head coach, says, I know that we've been down for a couple of years, but I'm expecting us to emerge like we did after down years in 06 and 07 when the Hawkeyes won 2 major bowl games against South Carolina and Georgia Tech in the Orange Bowl. We shall see out of Iowa. They're going to have to replace one of their best defensive players, Micah Hyde, and also quarterback James Vandenberg. The Hawkeyes 4-8 last season, taking on Iowa State. The best game for the Cyclones coming up here in 2013. That game on September 14th. And finally, we go to the bottom of the barrel. You know the bowl schedule is fairly ridiculous when 9 teams out of the 10 in the Big 12 made bowl games last year. The one that didn't, I think they almost made it with 1 win. Kansas at 1-11 under Charlie Weiss, their biggest game against Louisiana Tech, a 9-3 squad, losing its coach Sonny Dykes, who headed west to take over Cal. The Kansas Jayhawks, though, despite the 1-11 record, they stayed in games in the Big 12. They lost 5 of those games by less than a touchdown. They've got a quarterback battle brewing between Jake Heaps, who looks to be the starter. He's a recent transfer from BYU and a top quarterback recruit a couple seasons ago out of high school. Also Michael Cummings, who's a runner. So he's not in the Charlie Weiss mold, so expect Heaps to be the starting quarterback at Kansas. They also have James Sims, who's one of the best running backs in the Big 12. That's the good news on offense for the Jayhawks. On defense, not so much. They sacked the quarterback a total of 12 times last season, the entire team 12 times, and they gave up almost 300 yards passing per game against Big 12 competition. It's Kansas, it's Louisiana Tech on September 21st. That's a light, to be kind, a light Big 12 non-conference schedule. The best games, we believe, will be Texas-Ole Miss, Oklahoma, and Notre Dame, and also kind of like this TCU-LSU matchup as well. Would love to hear from you on the Big 12, the non-conference competition, the overall season out of any of these teams in the Big 12